9:30? Okay. Good morning. We're going to get started with our class here in the auditorium. This is our last lesson on Bible authority. We started 3 months ago, and here we are coming to the end of a quarter. Our new quarter will start next week, and Rob Perkins will be in here on Sunday morning, and I'll tell you more about that here, what's coming up next quarter at the end of our class. We've been building up and adding to our discussion, progressing through this study. And Bible authority is not a topic that we talk about a whole lot, and yet it permeates every aspect of what we're doing here. The building itself, our worship, what we do as a church, what we do as Christians. And it's extremely important. And we boil down the work of the church to 3 different areas and talked about these over the last couple of weeks. Preach the gospel, edify the saints, and provide for the needs of the saints. And we especially focus on the third one. There's not one passage that says, here is the work of the church. This is what you're supposed to do as a church. But throughout the letters and the book of Acts, invaluable to help us understand what the work of the church is. This is what we see, the focus of churches in the first century. I'm going to start this morning by going back to 1 Timothy 5. I'd like to ask you to turn there. We're going to be looking at several passages. 1 Timothy chapter 5, and we're going to work through this. We're going to think about some of these concepts. As a church, we have a collection, and we have funds. And those funds are used for preaching the gospel, edifying the saints, and sometimes providing for the needs of the saints. And what we're asking is, are there ways that we could misappropriate those funds? And we've said, well, that there's always a possibility for that. But that is not what God wants, certainly. You wouldn't want somebody to take your checking account and misappropriate the funds. Why would God want us to take his checking account and misappropriate them? Most of the time, we can see how important it is to just help preachers financially, preach the gospel. And the class materials that we have for the kiddos, PowerPoint machines, projectors, all that sort of thing. That we do that in the name of edification. We're trying to edify the saints. And something we don't see a lot in churches is helping Christians with financial needs. But we're starting to see more of that. Just because we have the money doesn't mean we have to spend it all right here and right now. That's not the point of what we're saying here today at all. So here is 1 Timothy 5, verses 8 and 9, the first part of verse 9 at least, on the screen. 1 Timothy 5, verse 9 starts listing qualities of a widow indeed. And you see there it says, let a widow be enrolled. And we asked that and answered the question, what is she being enrolled into? Let a widow be enrolled. Enrolled in what? Sir? Okay, I don't know if it's daily necessarily here in 1 Timothy 5. It was in Acts 6 for sure. In the Jewish community, that they had weekly distributions. And so Acts 5 is actually a little unusual, or Acts 6, a little unusual, is a daily distribution. But be that as it may, there's some sort of help. And the church has a list. We have prayer lists. What if we had widow lists? Or financial need list? And so what Paul says in verse 8 is, who has the responsibility to take care of their family members? Relatives. That's exactly right. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, he's worse than an unbeliever. He has denied the faith, he says. Now, there are those who are widows, and especially in the first century world, if they were widows, they had no children, they were destitute. They were completely dependent on others. And so the church made provisions for that. There's nothing wrong with that. It's perfectly scriptural. We see the church being authorized to do that, is what I mean by that. But then I'll drop down to verse 16. After listing these qualities, making some comments, then Paul says this in verse 16, if any believing woman has relatives who are widows. So he's flipping the tables here. He's saying that there's a Christian who has a family member who is a widow. Let her care for them, for the widows. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. You ever gone to the grocery store, especially lately, and it just racks up a high price at the grocery store? What you used to do is load up the same groceries, and it would come out so much. But after the last few weeks, with our inflation that we're dealing with, the same groceries pop up a very different amount. Whoa, what happened here? Do you have unlimited funds in your family checking account? So what if Apple Incorporated, what if they wanted to furnish all their companies, all their places, their headquarters, just their headquarters, we'll limit it to that. If they wanted to get rid of all their old furniture and get new furniture for their employees, could they do that without sweating too much? Yeah, they basically have unlimited resources. They've got a lot of money. Now, they're penny pinchers, I'm sure, in every organization. And they say, no, we're not going to do that. What about us as a church? Do we have unlimited funds? We've got a treasury, we've got money, but it's not unlimited. And even if it were, is it okay for us to just take the Lord's money and spend it any way we want? Well, no. Now, in this local church, as is prescribed in the New Testament, we have organization. And we've talked about that over the course of our study. We have elders who oversee, who rule this local congregation. When funds were sent from one church to another, who were those funds sent to? If you're sending it to a church, do you just send it to all the members, or they sent it to the elders? We read that in Acts 11, 27 through 30. The elders oversee the work of a local church. They know the needs of the congregation. When we had Hurricane Harvey hit us in Houston, when I was living there were churches, and I mentioned this last week, there were churches that were just so generous. And who did they send the money to? Who did they communicate with? The elders. When I'm there at the building and somebody calls, I say, hey, let me give you an elder's phone number. I'm not gonna deal with that. I wasn't one of the elders. We have limited funds, but we also have limited authority. We can't spend money on just anything and everything. And that's because we're a church. Sometimes when people come up here and they say, hey, or call, why don't you have rent money for me? And say, well, because we're a church. What are we focused on? What is our purpose primarily? Preach the gospel, to edify the saints. Now, can we take care of everybody in Corpus Christi with our money? And we talked about that principle a little bit last week with Jesus, who could freely heal people. He didn't heal everybody. There are a lot of people that he could have healed that he didn't. And what was the purpose of his miracles? To heal people? Well, sure, they benefited from it. But what was the main purpose for his miracles? That's right, to show who he was. And his disciples after him, when they performed miracles, it was to show that they were performing miracles in the name of Jesus. Peter and John at the temple. Silver and gold have I none, but what I have I give to you. In the name of Jesus Christ, I say to you, arise. And the man began to leap about. Let not the church be burdened. So if you see someone or know of a situation where it's a non-Christian, it's not a saint, it's not a member of the Lord's church, and help, can you give them some money? Is there anything stopping you from doing that other than limited funds? You can certainly do that. Now, we all know the parable of the Good Samaritan. Who is my neighbor is what the lawyer, the Pharisaical lawyer, asked. And Jesus answered that question, who is my neighbor, by telling the great parable of the Good Samaritan. And I'll just highlight here the actions taken by the Good Samaritan. He had compassion. He went up to him, bound his wounds. The next day, he took out 2 denarii, gave it to the innkeeper, and said, when I come back, if you use more than this, then I'll take care of that. Here is an individual helping out someone who is in need. Does the fact that the church can't be burdened with anything and everything limit me to be kind and helpful to others? Of course not. Absolutely. Galatians 6. Here's Paul writing to a church, and this is what he says near the end of this letter. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, especially to those who are of the household of faith. I guess I'll just stop there. Verse 10, Galatians 6, verse 10. As we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone. Everyone. Especially to those who are the household of faith. What does that mean? Those who are the household of faith. They go to church where I am? What does he mean by that, the household of faith? Okay. I would suggest that probably is referring to other saints, just like we see in the book of Acts, saints helping saints. But Paul says, do good to everyone. We are not limited as individuals with who we can give money to. Now, why would we even say that the church is limited, is not able to just feed the Corpus Christi community? Why would we even say that? I mean, there's no passage that says you can't. Why do we suggest that that's not really the work of the church, just feeding the community at large? It's a good thing to do, isn't it? Okay. And something else we mentioned last week, and we got a good chuckle out of it. If somebody comes to this door, as they do from time to time, and the eldership has given me a stack of hundreds, don't have a heart attack. That hasn't happened. But I say, oh yeah, you're in pretty bad need. So here's a couple hundreds. And then somebody else comes and says, oh man, you're really destitute. Here's $500 bills. All right. What's going to happen pretty soon? We're going to have a line out the door. Hey, I just went down to this church over here. We are not in the business of helping the community. Are we authorized? Can we, as a church, do that? What we're suggesting is, no, that's not what we see in the New Testament. We're appealing to Bible authority. That's what this whole issue is about. Now, wait a minute. This passage says we should do good to everyone. Now, maybe we try to focus on those who are fellow saints of the household of faith. Okay. Is this a big deal, though? So here is James 1, 26 and 27. Yes, sir. Widows, indeed, under the law, they were taken care of through gleaning. People who grew grapes and wheat. They were commanded to leave the wheat on the plants. The book of Ruth, that's all about a wheat harvest. There's some symbolism there, but it's about Ruth supporting a widow. Ruth herself was a widow, and she gleaned the wheat. In fact, Boaz, who was interested in her, what did he tell his men to do as they gleaned wheat? To drop some intentionally or leave it behind. And that was a community effort in a day when we didn't have Social Security. And of course, that works so well in our government today, doesn't it? Provides for all your needs. We all know about bureaucracy, but God cares about the orphan and the widow. And here's a principle presented in James 1, verses 26 and 27. Of course, you also had with widows, you had people who were supposed to redeem and take care of their family members, and there's a legal system for that. But basically, if you were a widow and you had no children, you were destitute. And it was not the responsibility of God to provide for you. It was a harsh environment. And while today we might think, well, that's cruel. It is tough. But that's why widows who have children are to be taken care of. This is part of the 10 Commandments. Honor your father and mother. If you're a widow, you have no children, you're in trouble under the old law. And especially if your health is broken. There was no commandment, provision that says, all right, let's get a community of funds and collect them and give them. In our government, there's no provision that says this is from the Bible. What is the responsibility today of us toward those who are saints who have no one to help them? They are widows indeed. Now, there are qualities that describe them. They must have washed the feet of the disciples. That's the most famous one. But there are other qualities to describe them. If someone will not work, neither let him eat. That's another important principle. It is not our job to feed the world. It is not our job to feed people who are not willing to work. So what do you do when you're at the gas station and you're just trying to pump gas, and somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I want to ask you a question. Can I have some money? And you've seen them elsewhere down the street begging for money. Are you obligated to help them? You said it's my choice? Okay. We're not commanded to do that? Okay. And there's a lot of factors. There's a lot of factors, especially living in the United States of America. Land of opportunity. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God, the Father, is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Churches divided over this verse back in the 50s and 60s. Why? Okay, or support orphans' homes through the church funds. Does that make sense? After all, James says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God is visiting orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Is this verse authorizing us to take church funds and support orphans' homes? Yes, ma'am.
My cousin, who was a very great Christian, has said several times.
Okay.
And this is her opinion. I kind of agree with it. Now, if it's a Christian, if it's somebody that you know that are Christians, and I do know these orphanages or homes for children, that's the way the church wants to spend its Christian development of those type of situations, that it could. It
Right.
If the congregation actually has a community mind of it, and it's something that they could, codify as something that they wanted to do with their money out of the church fund, that they could. And so it's just something to think about and not just closet blanket out and shut it down because they did it and we didn't.
Right.
There might be circumstances where you could do it and justifiably so.
Okay. Churches split over this issue.
Yes.
And I've heard many stories. I'm sure some of you who are older actually knew people who experienced these kinds of things. There were debates. Every generation, I've said this in the first few weeks, I haven't said it lately. Every generation has to re-examine the issues. We have to reconsider, is this scriptural or not? Instead of just taking what others have said in the past and to think about it. So there's a view that's we don't talk about a whole lot. Yes, ma'am. I don't think so. I don't think they're necessarily. Hey, tell me about your folks. Were they Christians? Yeah, I don't think so. Is this verse saying this is the activity, this is the work of a church? All right, and to strengthen that argument, it talks about keeping oneself unstained from the world. This is talking about us as individuals, certainly, in that part of it. But what about a church supporting orphans' homes? Don't we have, especially in the United States, don't we have organizations that are not religious or affiliated with a church at least, that do these sorts of things? Which would be easier, to just write a check and send it to an orphan's home, or to actually get involved in a big brother, big sister way, where you're actually involved in interacting with orphans? It's easy to just write a check, especially if it's the common treasury and you just send it on your way and say, okay, great, I feel great. I've visited orphans and widows in their affliction. Is that what James is saying here? Just cut a check and salve your conscience. I'm going to get my dad here. He had his hand up, and then I'm going to get you right there. Yes, sir. Okay. Then I'm going to get Doug.
Especially when a small congregation gets magnified, they had to line themselves with one or the other of these sides. And if we had the funds, we would send it to an orphan home.
Okay.
So one of the big arguments was, are you going to offload your responsibility to some organization that you may not have any control on how they spend their money, or whether they send all of their orphans to movies, and the whole thing, the whole responsibility of raising a child or caring for a widow is offloaded by a congregation when this is an individual.
Okay. Doug.
Okay, so in my studies, churches,
40s and 50s, yeah.
right. So I look at old church buildings.
Yeah.
And so there would be a thing in there like biggest thing for our money. Elders just send $5,000 they lost control.
Okay.
Our mission is to control what we spend funds on. Like Greg said, giving them
Yeah, but they're not going to do that because they're a religious organization or they adhere to biblical principles. And so they're not going to misuse God's funds that have been given to them. All right, I've got a couple hands. Yes, ma'am. Are they using church funds to do this? Their own funds. That's not really what we're talking about.
But they will hold I think they announced it for like about a month or two. They will hold a special election.
Okay. All right.
For that particular orphanage. And it's just one particular orphanage.
All right. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Okay. Well, and I'll counter that and say when we support men and we give them money, we are trusting them, we are investing in them, we are partnering with them, I guess is the word, the biblical word I would use. Gus, do you have some idea of what the preachers we're supporting are actually doing? And if so, how?
Well, probably the most recent, we
reports. That's what I'm trying to get at.
We get reports and,
right.
and speak with the incident. And we've had work in Mexico and another fellow that did a lot of work in China. And they were very, very good.
They were, and other churches supported them, and these men proved to be trustworthy. Have you ever heard of a church doing this, where they send someone without announcing we're going, and they send a couple guys down to Mexico or wherever, somewhere in the States, to see with their own eyes what they're doing, and then come back and say, you know what, this is not a good situation at all. Have you ever heard of that happening? Of course. So the reports are not required per se. However, we do have examples of preachers doing exactly that. That's what Paul and Barnabas did. They would go back and report in Antioch and Jerusalem and say, hey, this is what's going on. This is what happened. They would give reports. And services would be dedicated to that. We've had the brother we support in China, I'm forgetting his name, Daryl Emel. He's come and he has publicly talked about what he's doing. He's got pictures. Epa, before he passed away, we had him come in here and talk in his own language and tell us this is what's going on. Why did we do that? For several reasons. One, we want to be able to rejoice in his work. We want to be able to know the exciting work that he's doing in a difficult place. But we also want to be able to have some semblance of control over the funds that we're sending, instead of just saying, here you go. But really and truly, when you give somebody money and say, here you go, you have lost control. So I hear what you're saying, but I also hear what these others are saying. When you give it to an organization, they don't have to give you an account of what the money, what they've done with the money. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. If this congregation, what happened to congregational autonomy too?
Okay.
And
congregational autonomy, that's very important.
Yes. And so, if this congregation was of a mind that we felt like we were not crossing any lines to make a monthly donation, say, somebody's on the board of that little home or whatever, and they know where the money's going. They know what's being done with it, and we can, just like the preachers, you get a report back. You know what's happening. I think in certain situations, the congregation can do things that to the rest of the world, like, it makes no sense to them. We can have different ideas inside this congregation and not have to split over it.
That's right.
And,
we can.
Yeah,
We should.
And there's some things I don't agree with. But, I'm okay. We're okay.
Okay.
And so there are some things, and I'm not saying this is gospel, but anyway, there are some things that are kind of muddy water.
Right.
If your congregation, though, has a like mind about it and sees it a certain way, then it's nobody else's business what that congregation does in its own autonomy.
Okay. And that is very true about church autonomy. However, we are trying to please God, and we don't want to misappropriate his funds.
No, but I'm saying there's a lot of people that have trouble with a fancy building, and this would be called a fancy building.
Well, I've seen some fancy buildings, and
Yeah, I have.
we got a courtyard. I mean, is that scriptural?
Yeah, I mean, that literally has come up in the law in the courtyard.
Yeah.
So there's so many timelines, but that, I don't know. I think it's up to the congregation a lot of things.
Absolutely. Here's a very good verse. If anyone sees his brother in need and just doesn't give him anything, how does God's love abide in him? Do we have a responsibility to help those less fortunate? I think we could substantiate that from these verses. That's what we're here to do. I'm going to close this section, but we're not done. We still got about 10 minutes left. We are created for good works. We are God's handiwork. Workmanship is, I think, how the ESV renders it. A lot of versions do. We have been created by God in his image. He is all powerful. He is all loving, and he wants us to perform good works. One of the letters, late letters of Paul, Titus, emphasizes good works everywhere. It's just that concept comes up repeatedly throughout Titus. We are here to do good works. And there are people who come to us or come to you at work and say, well, what does your church do? Let me tell you what we do. We send money, and we're part of an organization that's feeding millions of people in Africa. What are y'all doing? But is that the work of the church? To feed the world. We have a baseball team. How come I wasn't included?
My question is, where is it?
All right, once you start, where does it stop? That's a huge concern. When we were looking at Acts 11, 27 through 30, I had this chart. If you want to look at Acts 11, 27 through 30 again and remind yourself of what's going on here. You have the growing work in Antioch. So here's the church at Antioch in Syria to the north. And Jerusalem is where it all started, right? Well, it says that prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. And Agabus, a New Testament prophet, able to predict the future, he says there's going to be a famine in Judea. Now, Antioch is far away from Judea, which is where Jerusalem is. And he says there's going to be a famine. And what do the saints determine to do? Verse 29, so the disciples determined, everyone according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea. They did so, sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul. So they took up a collection, and they sent the funds to Jerusalem. And we asked this question. We built on this. This isn't here, but we asked this question. What if the church at Antioch said, hey, this is a great work. There are needy saints in Jerusalem, in Judea. We want you, churches, and these cities had churches. I put on the screen, but I'm just doing that to give it a little historical context. But what if the church at Antioch had said, send us your funds, and then we will send them to Jerusalem? And that's called a sponsoring church arrangement. Is that what happened in Acts 11, 27 through 30? So we said, no. Now, what if the Antioch church said, this is great work, and we demand you send us money? Well, they're losing church autonomy, aren't they? But what if they told them about the great work? They emailed them all and said, this is what we're doing, just wanted to let you know. Could these various churches send their own funds to help with the work? That's a great idea. Let's do that. Would that be scriptural? And we suggested, well, that's what we see. Another important principle, and this goes to church autonomy. Churches are ruled by elders. Let me make that singular. A church, a local congregation, is ruled by its eldership. Funds are sent to the elders of the church. Well, that makes sense, because what is the job of an eldership? To shepherd the flock of God that is among you. Hebrews 13, verses 7 as well as 17, talk about our leaders. And these are the people who do rule the church. Peter in 1 Peter 5 goes on to say that you have oversight over this church. Does that mean that an eldership can do anything that they want? No, because they too are answerable. Who are they answerable to? The chief shepherd, specifically, the shepherd the flock of God. It's God's flock, as God would have you. Not doing it for financial gain, personal gain, not domineering of those in charge, 1 Peter 5, verse 3, being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, that's Jesus, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. All three of our elders are here right now. Do you serve as an elder for the glory? Is that your motivation? Yay, I'm an elder in the church. I'm going to put it on my resume. For the glory of God and for service. And is this just an easy peasy work that you all are doing? Piece of cake? It's hard work. You have any sleepless nights? Okay, there's accountability. But as you're doing your work, are there times when you are fretting and worrying about the sheep? Okay, you sleep well. But then you also stay up late at night saying, what are we going to do with that Marc Hinds guy? What in the world? What is the focus of a New Testament church? Acts 2, verse 42. The church is established right there in Acts chapter 2. We're going to be looking at this more on Wednesday night, as a matter of fact. That dovetails well. The saints, the people who had just become Christians, devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, the breaking of bread, the prayers. I emphasize the because they're all emphatic here. They're all just really being emphasized in this verse, which is very interesting. Now, what if we decided, I'm going to put these up here. And so these are meant to just get us thinking a little bit. What if we as a church decided to sponsor a nationwide radio or TV program? Before the days of the internet, this is something that a lot of churches did. Of course, people still watched cable television shows, and you've got folks preaching the gospel 24/7. Could we do that as a church? Could we have our own nationwide TV program? Could we? I think we could. That's preaching the gospel, isn't it? How are we going to pay for it? Because that's going to be a little expensive, isn't it? Doug? We just need more money to do it. So what we're going to do, because we can't afford it, we're going to start calling a bunch of other churches and say, we want you to send this church funds so that we can have a nationwide radio program. Yes, sir. Okay. And who's paying for that airtime? Yes, sir. Expedience.
There's some things that are nailed down in the scripture. Some examples. Look at the scripture. But you can't deny. What I think there will be exceptions. Jews, they were part of the legalism, even for paying taxes, they had a problem. Taxes weren't
Okay.
given purpose of so they thought that giving taxes to the Roman was wrong. And so it was hard for them to separate that. I believe we can become the same. I bought
Yeah, in their culture, there wasn't a lot of difference. I don't know that there is.
Then we wanted lights, which cost money. So because it's a social gathering, using the large money.
Yes.
Maybe that's
All right. So in our study, have we solved every issue? Have we even attempted to do that? We're trying to think about some of these things. What about the swimming pool in the courtyard? I mean, it's a great courtyard. The kids can play, but you know what? We shouldn't do it because of liability issues. No, we probably shouldn't do it because why? It's not edifying. It's not preaching the gospel, that's for sure. How about building a swimming pool in my backyard? Or getting me that Rolex. Remember I talked about that last week? I saw on the news some preacher who was upset his church didn't buy him a Rolex. And the fellowship hall. The fellowship hall. Using the Lord's funds to build a nice facility. Is that a settled issue? Well, yeah. I mean, we don't do that. And yet, we need to revisit that issue. We need to think about that. Can we take the Lord's money? Because I tell you, if we can, or better yet, if God says, well, you shouldn't do that, but I'm not going to get mad at you about it, then let's do it. Because they're fun. We wouldn't have to go out to Shane and Amy's. We just have a great big gathering ourselves. And they'd be fun. But one of the concerns is, well, one, can we indeed do that? Can we take the Lord's money and build something that is for fun and recreation? And two, when you start doing that sort of thing, where do you stop? You just keep going down that path. That is a concern. I'm not saying that is the reason, but it is definitely a factor. Let me ask you this about differences between what churches do and what we do as individuals. Can I partake of the Lord's Supper at home? On a Sunday, I'm at home. Can I partake of the Lord's Supper? Let me give you my answer since we're about out of time. 1 Corinthians 11 describes it as a congregational activity, the Lord's Supper, when you come together to partake of the Lord's Supper. I don't think there's anything wrong with you partaking the Lord's Supper if you're sick on Sunday and you want to take it at home. But it is described as a congregational activity. That's right. During COVID, and we weren't here in the building. I think there were like 3 or 4 of us. Remember that, Glenn? Just a handful of us. And we placed an emphasis on doing it all together at the same time. Obviously, somebody could sleep in and have their bunny rabbit slippers on and start watching at 2 o'clock. And say, yeah, this is great. I get to stay home. And that's a whole other set of issues right there. What about me taking my money, not the money that's been laid at the apostles' feet, not the money that's been contributed, taking my money and giving it to an orphan's home or to a college that I think promotes biblical principles in their teaching? No problem there. No problem there. Can I send money to a political campaign? Why would you? Can you? Can the church send money to a presidential campaign? You sure don't have control over that. I like that. I like that. All right. This is an important topic. And so two closing comments that are repeating some of the things we've talked about. One, this is not glamorous. This is not super exciting. Oh boy, we're going to talk about Bible authority at church today. Yay! But it's important. It's important. And two, we must always re-examine the issues for ourselves. We must not just assume, well, this is what we've been taught all these years. We've got to rethink. We've got to re-examine. And that's what we've tried to do. Now, coming up next quarter, Rob's going to be in here on Sunday morning. I mentioned that. Larry is going to finish after a year. It was a year ago that he taught 1 Samuel. And on Sunday night, he's going to be in here in his inimitable way, talking to us about the great book of 2 Samuel. A lot of application. And then Walker's going to help me out. We're going to teach a study on loving like Jesus. It'll be similar to what we did previously when we talked about our relationships as Christians, the terms used to describe us. So we will have our turn and talk questions. But it's taking a look at 1 Corinthians 13, the qualities of love. Love is kind, love is forgiving, love does not brag, all those various qualities that are used to describe love. And how Jesus lived them, how he lived them. So we're going to go from 1 Corinthians 13 to the Gospels and then to application. And I hope you'll be here for that on Wednesday night, starting actually December 14th, right? Because we'll have our singing night first. So I need to change that. I'm going to double check that, but I believe it starts September 14th. Looking forward to that on Wednesday nights. Thank you so much for studying this important topic, Bible authority, with me this quarter. And Shane, I forgot. Shane dumped the last few sessions on me, so I forgot. Sorry. Not exactly how it happened, but